Real stories of werewolves, of dogman from history, from your emails, illustrated and animated with the democratizing magic of machine learning AI. Welcome to Scary Stories.
I love her since kindergarten, but now her claws get long and hard. She ain't even any kind of man. She's a werewolf and a woman. My woman is a lady wolf man. I thought a girl since kindergarten, now the claws get long and harder. She ain't even any kind of man. She's a werewolf and a woman. My woman is a lady wolf man. Hit that guitar, honey. Is a lady wolf man. Watch a full episode of Lady Dogman stories on Scary Stories. NYC.
Blonde Werewolf Tribe. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I've been convinced by my adult son to write up my personal werewolf experiences into a sort of memoir for you to read on your show. I actually got serious about it a little while back when I thought you were going to quit YouTube or something. I paid for Grammarly to help me write this, but I don't think you have to give them any kind of credit, because I paid for the service. There were some places where the way they phrased things was too highfalutin for my taste, so I put it back the way I would have said it. Feel free to fix whatever is broken in it, as long as you can please leave the main details in the way I put them. I'll tell you right up front that I changed some of the information myself in order to keep from shining a light on any of the people from this story who are still alive. It did happen 50 or more years ago, but we were all young people and more than half of us are still alive today. A very few continue to live off the land into their 60s and 70s, but most of us have found a way to live a dual life as both human and werewolf. A handful of us, like myself, have been lucky enough to remain completely human and to raise our own families. But I was in and out before I was 30, and I never actually took the plunge to become a werewolf, so I wasn't as scarred by that period as some of us were. I think I need to stop talking in generalities and just start at the beginning. I can't remember the exact date all these years later, but I remember I was hanging around my father's gas station. I should mention that I'm female because I know that nobody would be able to suss that out from your voice, since you're obviously not. I guess I was 15. Or no, wait, I would have been almost 15. And a car pulled in for gas with music blasting incredibly loud. Louder than I had ever heard music played in a car back then. This would have been the summer of 1970, and most cars had only one tiny and tinny little radio speaker. All of the windows of this car were rolled up, but the driver rolled hers down, and all this really skunky smelling smoke came billowing out. I mean, it wasn't exactly the smell of a skunk, but it was close. As the smoke cleared, I could see that the entire car was filled with girls, all a year or two older than me, up to maybe their mid-20s max. There had to have been 10 of them inside that one car, almost all of them blonde, and all of them sitting on each other's laps, and singing off-key with the music. Now, normally my dad and my brother, who ran the gas station together, hated loud music. Anyone who played music too loud was a hippie in their minds, and they felt all hippies should be rounded up, drafted, and sent over to Vietnam. They didn't seem to think these girls should be kicked out of the country, though. In fact, they didn't even ask them to lower the music any. I took note of these girls' power over the male members of my family, and I immediately wanted to be their friend. I looked into the car windows wide-eyed, and I started asking them questions about their clothes and their makeup. One of them asked me if I wanted to learn how to do my own makeup, and I looked at my dad with pleading eyes, hoping he'd grant me permission. At first he scowled, saying that the day I apply makeup to my face was the day he'll be ready to be planted 6 feet under. But when one of those two incredibly stunning platinum blonde twins told my father she'd take good care of me, he completely reversed his tune. He went from saying that makeup was invented by the devil to saying that it was important for me to learn how to do it correctly, and that these girls obviously knew everything there was to know about makeup. So I went from meeting the first bad girls I had ever met to riding off with them in their smoke-filled car in under 5 minutes. I thought it was like meeting superheroes, even before I found out about their actual superpowers. So yeah, the two leaders were twins and the prettiest girls in the bunch. Really, Tessa was the leader, and her identical twin Gail was sort of considered co-leader just because she looked exactly the same as pack leader. Her personality was not one of a commander, though. I mean, Tessa is still alive, and she's dropped back into society, gaining quite a bit of political clout over the decades. Gail, on the other hand, didn't make it into the 80s. She passed away in the woods in a tragic accident that I was not present to witness. I had left the group sometime before that, and I remember urging Gail to get out while she could. I knew she would never leave her twin sister Tessa, though, except of course in the way that she did. But when I was in the pack, Tessa laid down the law, and Gail enforced it. How did she enforce it? Well, unlike most of us, Gail and Tessa were werewolves. They would turn to white werewolves in front of our eyes, and it was a magnificent sight to see. There were, I think, 5 others in the group at the time, most of the time, who were also werewolf shapeshifters. I had thought that they were all turned by the twins, but I later learned that 2 of them had joined the pack after being banned from a different pack. Now, there are some werewolf experts who tell me that I'm a liar for stating that the pack ran with human girls, but that's just the truth. I mean, I'm not a werewolf now. I never took the plunge. But we did hunt and scavenge along with the werewolves. And we did learn a great deal about life from them as well. But that was a time when girls were still girls and men were still men, so when I was finally accepted into the group, my hair was dyed blonde. It was a sort of a baptism, I guess you might say. My dad didn't like it, but he kept his grumbling to himself because he didn't have the will to disobey the twins, or at least not Tessa. It's not true that all werewolves have the power of persuasion. That's sort of more the territory of vampires. Tessa, however, had the ability to make you do what she wanted you to do. Remember, I told you she's in politics these days, right? Well, she's just following where her natural talents lead her. At any rate, both my brother and dad were enchanted, and I could get them to do anything I wanted, as long as they thought it was Tessa that wanted it. So when I first joined, we would all go to the woods together and just go wild, in the style of the times. There was quite a bit of growing up that I had to do quite fast. We all soon got into our own werewolf version of witchcraft that we half made up ourselves, and we started calling ourselves witches, which I thought was so sophisticated. We would have bonfires and ceremonies, and we tried to conjure spirits, but mostly we drank the spirits, as I remember it. We saw ourselves as dangerous, and possibly evil, but we never actually hurt anybody, and the animals we took were only for food, never for sacrifices or anything like that. So I think in retrospect we were actually fairly benign for a cult of weird girls who would go on wild night hunts with literal werewolves leading the charge. Some nights the werewolves would howl, and we would all be encouraged to sing along with them. We called it singing, but we meant howling. We tried to follow the lead of Tessa, and she had the most mournfully sad way of singing. It was always very moving to hear her. When the pack would transform for the hunt, they all got this look in their eyes that I've almost never seen in human eyes in my life. They were ecstatic, and excited, and angry and happy and deliriously so in each case. They had looks on their faces like mad scientists get in movies when they just discovered the secret of life. They got looks in their eyes like some movie superhero or supervillain feeling their powers for the first time. And every transformation was just as exhilarating to watch as any other. I've read stories about werewolves that claim they get so used to transforming that it becomes a fast and casual thing for them. Well, it never did for my girls. They would scream just as loud each time it happened. And they would sound so surprised each time too, as if they had never felt anything like this before. Sometimes as a spectator, I could actually predict what was going to happen next better than the person it was happening to. But when it came to Tessa, she was always so happy to transform. To her, those were the happiest times. And you could hear her screaming as much in triumph as in pain. So grateful was she for the lycanthropy that she regarded as a gift. There were nights when the wolves wanted to hunt more dangerous game, and that was when you saw the separation between werewolves and humans. The wolves would go out to hunt, and we girls would stay back at the camp, preparing things for their eventual return. It was like the werewolf girls were the men, and the human girls weren't. So I also learned to cook that summer in a cauldron over a fire. Speaking of lessons, we also had more laid-back nights, usually when it was moonless about halfway between each full moon. Those nights were almost more like being in the Girl Scouts than a werewolf pack, as the wolf girls would teach us basic survival skills and test each of us on what we had learned. You know, years later in the 90s, I once disarmed a knife-wielding meth freak who wanted to mug me, and I learned that move from Tessa and Gail back in the early 70s. They wanted us to learn self-sufficiency from them, which was a true gift, I have to say. They used to call themselves feminist at the time, but they taught equally to men who would attend our gatherings as well. There was no hostility in their version of what we called feminism, but the word has become a lightning rod in the decades since, so I hesitate to use it here. It was a time when a lot of us girls were waking up to the fact that new horizons were opening up to us, whether we liked it or not. Although I was married and raising kids by the mid-80s, I probably would have been raising them a decade earlier if I hadn't made friends with Tessa and Gail and the others. I know that if I hadn't had my adventures when I was young, I would have gone crazy as a mom, and I probably would have walked out on my marriage. As it is, I'm still married to the same wonderful man, the father of our children, and I know I made the right decision for me personally to go and run with the werewolf girls when I was a teenager. I'm praying that one of my now grown kids has children of their own, because I want to tell them stories of how Grandma used to run naked with a pack of feral girl werewolves. Either they'd think I was the best grandma ever, or else their parents would force me to chip in for the psychiatric treatment, but no matter the outcome, it would be something to scratch off my bucket list. I am telling this story now as a woman old enough to have grandchildren, even if I don't yet. But I should probably emphasize again that all of this happened as I was still becoming an adult. I grew up with that pack, joining them as a girl and leaving as a fully grown woman. My memories of running wild with the she-wolves are the equivalent of other people's memories of high school and college. This was how I came of age. This was how I learned what a woman really is. And this was where the pack introduced me to my first serious boyfriend. It was when the twins decided that I was an adult that they began their matchmaking machinations. This young man was a friend of one of the girls in the pack, and she just thought that the two of us would get along. She passed this info on to Gail, who told Tessa, and the next thing you knew, that boy and I were side by side at the next witchcraft bonfire. I had never even kissed a boy before, but with the entire pack encouraging both of us, we found it surprisingly easy to become close. Natural. That's the word we overused in that era. It felt perfectly natural to go from just meeting to extremely close, because it was what everyone expected us to do, so it was only natural. This boy actually went on to become a werewolf, though, which is not a path I wanted to walk, and not a path that Tessa thought would be good for me either. She told me one time that if everyone was cut out to be a werewolf priestess like her, then there would be no more moms and dads for the human race. Everyone would be out in the woods hunting and scavenging, and the human infrastructure would collapse. She always told me that eventually I would leave the pack, but I would leave with a deep inner understanding of what was natural and what wasn't. There's that word again. Her prediction turned out to be true, but sadly I think my departure was sped up by changes to the pack that felt awful to me. That boyfriend of mine becoming a werewolf changed the dynamic. He brought in other young male maverick wolves who battled Tessa for leadership, forcing her to bend to their wills in order to maintain any power at all. When I left him, I left the pack. I would have felt bad about leaving Gail and Tessa in that moment when they were struggling to maintain control, but both of them urged me to go while I could. They told me that the men were already discussing turning all the girls into werewolves, and banning anyone from leaving to go on their own unless banished. This did in fact happen after my departure, where for about a year the males ran the pack and Tessa was made to publicly serve them in order to keep the woman's morale low. Eventually it led to the big war between the wolves. That was the event that Gail did not make it through. She gave her life to wrest control of the pack back from their rivals, but there was so much loss on both sides after that fight that the pack dissolved, with some few going off to live off the land in the woods, but most returning to human society, keeping their werewolf personae secret and going undercover. Tessa, as I said before, is quite a powerful person now, but I can't get into any more detail about that without putting us all at risk. A young woman that my son is dating recently lectured me about feminism as though I were not also a woman like she is, and as though the word were invented in her generation. When she described to me how much better the world would be without men in it, I started informing her that I once lived in a female-controlled tribal society, and she didn't even slow down her lecture. She knew better than people who learn from life. After all, she learned from government-influenced media. At some point, like all humans, she had to take a breath, so I inserted a little story about my old friend Tessa, and how she would go insane before chasing an animal that she had decided was her prey. Her eyes would open so widely that this beautiful woman started looking like a monster, even before her transformation had begun. She would open her mouth wider than I'd ever seen anyone do it, and all of her teeth were on display as they grew and mutated into the teeth of a feral carnivorous canine that walked like a woman. My son's girlfriend asked me why I was telling her that. I answered that if you're not going to allow men in your society, then you will need women like Tessa. You will need women who will go out and kill living beasts to bring back to the tribe for dinner. You can say that men are beasts, but your tribe is going to need beasts in it to survive in the real world. If you're going to disallow men, then you better learn how to do what they do without their help. She started to tell me that she refuses to eat meat, and I told her you can't pick lattes off a bush and that quiche doesn't grow on trees. She called me various things that I don't think were actual words. Maybe they were internet words. This young woman couldn't hear anything I was saying, because she's already smarter than those of us who think for ourselves, you see. It's easy to know everything, if all you do is repeat talking points written by your keepers. Even Tessa, who loved only women, never banned men from her pack. Some might say she lived to regret that, but she knew it would be wrong to do. It would be unnatural. And nobody seems to care too much about nature or logic anymore in 2023, do they? Those are just a couple of old lessons that I learned from the blonde werewolf tribe. Godzilla Tim bought me some coffee. I like mine sweeter than English toffee. Thanks to Big G, food's back on my plan. I eat from the donations of this kind man. Please join me in thanking Godzilla Tim in the UK for making this episode possible. He donated to us directly using our paypal.me/PeterBernard209 page, which is the way to get me cash most quickly. You can also do it through YouTube, and that's great as well. But PayPal sends me the money in seconds, not next month. It's awesome either way because I will still need to eat next month. At least, I hope I still will need to. Dog Rescue Werewolf. Dear Scary Stories NYC. I find myself caught up in a bad situation because I didn't listen to people who warned me about a werewolf pack. I deliberately walked into a dangerous area because I thought I knew better than the locals knew about their own area. I was arrogant, and now I've got to pay the price for the rest of my life. This is because I allowed myself to get bitten by what I thought was a dog, but what was actually something far worse, something that I am now as well. I had just finished grad school, and I was volunteering at an animal rescue. I had seen a pack of dogs hanging out by an old abandoned house on my way into town, and when I had a chance, I brought them up with my manager. I figured if we were the local animal rescue people, then we should be finding them new homes, or else we should figure out what else should be done about these dogs. I mean, that abandoned house was a 10-minute walk from the office I was sitting in, so it seemed like this was something that had to be taken care of. Well, my supervisor wouldn't even discuss it with me, but she wouldn't say why. She just looked scared and changed the subject each time I brought those stray dogs up. One day at lunch, a coworker came to me and quietly explained that the dog pack I had seen was a pack of werewolves. I inhaled my bottled water and I choked for a while. A pack of what? When I could breathe again, I told my coworker that she and everyone else around there was just a superstitious yokel. I said those dogs had been left abandoned, and it was our job to rescue them, not to make up ghoulish fables explaining why it's okay if we don't. Someone else in the office came over and told me to calm down. When people tell me to calm down, I get even angrier, and so I stormed out of that office into the hot night. I needed some air, and also I had decided to walk the 10 minutes to that abandoned house and eyeball the situation those dogs were living in. Then I figured I could sleep on it and pitch a plan to my bosses in the morning. It seemed like a good idea to me, and I expected to be praised for my ambition. When I got down to the house, I only saw a few of the smaller dogs at first. I bent down to pet one and saw that he was covered in ticks. I could smell that house interior from outside, and I didn't think it was a good place to just let these dogs continue to live in. The little ones gathered around me were all friendly. Too friendly, in fact, until I could get them a flea bath. I was about to laugh out loud at the concept of these pups being monsters, but then a very large, light-colored dog appeared right next to us. I mean, I suppose he walked up, but he did so silently, and I was surprised to suddenly notice him so nearby. I gasped and drew back quickly, which frightened one of the smallest of the dogs, who snapped in my hand and bit me. The bite was surprisingly painful, and I made a noise which seemed to anger the larger beast. The huge dog growled at me so deeply that it made the ground under my feet vibrate. It pulled its black lips back and revealed teeth big enough to fit in the mouth of a tyrannosaur. Once he had my attention, though, I saw the creature's lips once again close, and the vibration all around us ceased. The immense beast looked at me, and a flood of thoughts and ideas washed through my mind. I thought at first that these were my own thoughts, but some of them were very alien to me and made no sense. I suddenly happened upon the concept that my mind field was intertwining with the large dog's energy field. Now that's not something I would have ever thought before. To me, the mind was in the brain, but when I was near that large dog, I could sense that we were each walking in a field of electricity, and that our mind and our personality were sort of part of the electric field we were equipped with. When he stood that close to me, it sounded like radio interference, and it tickled in an uncomfortable way in my belly. I began to know things, and I didn't like these things I was knowing. They were mean things. They were nasty things. I looked at the dog, and he looked so happy to see me sad. Now, none of this seemed possible. I decided I'd better get home because I was starting to get groggy in the heat and imagine things. But then that dog breathed his hot breath into my ear, and I could hear words in the hot, smelly air. They were words of discouragement. They were insulting words. Well, they were insulting ideas and thoughts, let's say. I'm not sure if I was hearing words or if I was hearing intent or meaning. I'm not sure if that makes sense, but I'm also not sure if this experience itself made sense. So either I was imagining things, or that big dog was telling me that I was one of them. They didn't need to be rescued, but I did. He was telling me I was going to leave my job and I was going to come live with him, like a dog. And it made sense. The way he told it to me, it made sense to me, so I started to think it over. It was a terrifying moment when I realized exactly what I had just been thinking over. An offer to give up my humanity and live like a dog in filth. The creature must have a hypnotic ability, if it is just a creature after all. I suspected I was dealing with a hypnotist who was creating the illusion of the large dog. Never once did I consider the explanation the others had already given me before I even came there. This was a pack of werewolves. This was not a pack of stray dogs at all. It was a far simpler solution, so why did I never consider it? Why had I thought I knew better than the people who had lived here for years already? Then I realized that my second set of thoughts seemed just as crazy as my first set had seemed. Werewolves weren't real. But you know what is real? Leaking gas fumes. I looked around and I sniffed around. Something was making me hallucinate. Something was making me think crazy thoughts. I figured there must be some kind of gas or electrical field making people imagine things. They say this can happen on those ghost hunting shows, so maybe that was what was happening at that old place. I wondered if methane could make you see things because there did seem to be an odor of it at the location. I liked that explanation, that something had been causing people to hallucinate in the vicinity of the dogs for all these years, and that was how the legend of them being werewolves had begun. I started walking away from the location and back toward the office when I could feel the transformation beginning. I didn't feel as though anything were visible on the exterior yet, but I could feel both my top and bottom rows of teeth begin to grow outward, and they brought my nose with them. It was only the very beginning of it, but I somehow knew what was going to happen next, just the same as if it had happened to me before. It was what the big dog had told me was gonna happen. I was becoming like one of them. This made me feel pretty panicked, and I ran to get back to the office. It was gonna be a long run though, and when I passed some houses, I screamed to the people inside for help. A man came out of one of the houses and a woman out of another. Both of them seemed concerned and asked me what was wrong. I told them that I was being turned into a wolf, and they both looked down the road toward the abandoned house that the dog pack lived in. "You've been at the house, haven't you?" asked the woman. But the man answered for me, saying, "That's exactly where she's been. You can tell just by looking at her." The woman gave me a glare for having interrupted her chores and returned inside her house. The man practically ran backward to get behind the locked door and away from me. Everybody knew those dogs were werewolves. Everybody knew. Nobody was going to help me, and it was my own fault. I had been warned, and I just laughed. I called people superstitious, but I was the one who was out of touch with reality. I could feel sideburns starting to grow in, just the same as I could feel my nose and my jaws expanding forward. Everything was spinning both inside and out, and I was panicking. I just sort of ran down the road, not wanting to bother any more people in the homes I was running past. They would only glare at me. They would only tell me that I brought it on myself. The end of my nose felt like it was on fire, as the cartilage inside it rearranged itself, as if it had done this 1,000,000,000,000 times before. I screamed out, sometimes in pain, sometimes from the sheer weirdness I was experiencing. With the changes came this occasional burst of anger and hatred toward the entire world. In those moments, I wanted to tear living things apart. It must be what they call the blood rage. I can understand why people are scared of us werewolves. We have manic and violent tendencies. I mean, there are times when you feel so agitated that you could eat through a wooden fence. That's what it feels like. And of course, it's a lot worse on the full moon. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me stick to that first time they made me transform. The first hair I remember growing was on my chin and along the sides of my face where the sideburns grow on men. My teeth began changing early on too. They were long fangs first, and then the jaw actually began to extend outward, as fur grew on it simultaneously. With me that first time, I grew fur on my face that fell out and grew back and fell out and grew back, all within a period of maybe 10 or 20 minutes. It was a different color each time. Sometimes it was one color like blonde, and other times it grew in patterns, the way you might expect on an animal. Now, none of this hurt exactly, but it was also incredibly uncomfortable, and sometimes I just screamed from how it was making me freak out. I've always been a very squeamish person, and this is the most annoying non-stop biological cause of squeamishness that I've ever had to endure. Try to imagine what it might feel like for your internal organs to reorganize themselves inside of your rib cage while your bones and cartilage pop and morph around them. I would not actually begin to have my body change its outward appearance until after my face decided to finish becoming a werewolf face. But the insides were cracking and popping as though getting ready for the big transformation. It felt horrible. Some people say that transforming into or back from a werewolf can be an ecstatic experience. I think they must have a different definition of ecstasy from mine, because werewolf transformations for me suck. I keep talking about how nasty it feels, but there are also random points where you just get seized up in excruciating pain too. I mean the kind of sudden pain that comes out of nowhere, grabs your entire body up hard in a cruel way, and when it subsides a few seconds later, you literally have already forgotten who you were and what you were about to do before that pain wave hit you. You know, it's sort of weird about the werewolf thing. People talk about it like it's Jekyll and Hyde, one personality or the other. But especially in that first transformation, I kept forgetting who I even was over and over, and having to wake up into life again each time. I don't just mean forgetting my name, but forgetting what I was, where I was, the whole enchilada, as my mother says. So, rather than feeling like Dr. Jekyll battling Mr. Hyde for control, to me it's more like the transformations remind me that neither my human nor my wolfen personalities are really even real. The real me is the one that keeps waking up from the extremely uncomfortable parts of the transformation. The real me is the one that's there wondering where I am and who I am. That's the real me. And that's the real you and the real everybody. The personality is like a program or an app you're running. But when you wake up with amnesia, that's your operating system. That's the real you, see what I mean? And the human and the werewolf selves, those are just two apps you're running in the operating system that you really are. Trippy, right? But that's how I strongly feel about it, because of the way I kept blacking out in the middle of the big change, and the way I had to keep, over and over, re-examining who I was and where I was. And each time I caught a glimpse of my reflection, it looked different than it had the time before. It was not one steady progression toward being a canine. It was advance and then retreat and then advance again, with a different approach almost every time. I did not get claws, I did not get body fur, until the very end of the process. Although that is not usually the way it's happened since then. It's more of a hair growth first kind of phenomenon now, but that first time it was almost as though the fates were trying out different kinds of fur and different kinds of fangs and dog snouts and so forth. I did get little doggy ears, but they were never as big as my hair, so they weren't even visible in most transformations. I saw cats run away from me in fear. I saw parents pull their children inside as I passed. I looked at scared faces peering out at me from behind locked windows, and I tried to tell them that I wasn't dangerous, but all that came out was a long, low, mournful howl. Walking became more difficult as I felt my ankles and feet becoming something else entirely. I am able to run much faster after the transformation is complete, but I'm not good for much of anything while the changing process is still going on. After some length, I began to realize that humans were no longer my friends, nor were the kinds of animals that humans like to have around them. Suddenly I felt a deep hatred for pets, for squirrels, for songbirds. I now wanted to hurt and silence each of them. I now understood how they hated me, and it wasn't so much that I hated them back. It was more like I knew I was being ostracized and cast out forever. It was quite an intense feeling of hopelessness, on top of the agony and the awareness that things were only going to get a lot worse from here. I found myself passing out leaning on people's fences, waking up seeing red and thinking horrible thoughts of eating things alive. At other points I remember staggering around and wondering where I was and what I was doing there. Everything was uncomfortable, and I was so incredibly hot. I mean, it was a very warm night to start with. My mouth was now part of an animal's snout, like a dog or a pig. That's how I felt, too, like a pig. The transformation continued and continued, until my face was entirely covered in fur. Then, once that was done, the rest of my body tickled all over intensely, as fur covered every centimeter of skin within just seconds. I let out a noise because of that, which not only didn't sound like a sound I would make, it didn't sound like a sound I could make. It was an animal noise, and I knew that I was an animal. So I went back to that big dog, just as he said I would. I am not able to hold down a job any longer. I have not gotten my werewolfism under control yet. Each time I turn, I run back to that big dog just like he told me to. I had to move back in with my mother, as she keeps me tied up in the yard at night so that I can't run off again. If I didn't know better, I'd say my mother actually prefers me in this predicament. She jokes that I'm easier to train now than I've ever been before, but I don't see what's so funny about that. I don't see what's so funny about any of this. I would like my mother to help me find a way to reverse this werewolf curse, but she doesn't seem particularly motivated to do so. She says all the werewolves she knows do their own research. I feel that her sense of humor is completely inappropriate in light of my terrible situation. In the movies, mothers help cure their sick kids. In reality, they celebrate their daughters' failures and setbacks because they no longer understand the role of a nurturer. These days, mothers compete with their daughters, and nobody ever grows up. And I'm never going to be able to grow up and have my own life either, unless I can somehow undo this werewolf curse, which I caught off of that. Dog, rescue, werewolf. She's as bright as a supernova. Of course, I'm talking about Stell Cordova. Please join me in thanking today's executive producer, Stell Cordova, for making this episode possible. Stell is a channel member, and so she gets to see our secret, uncensored Dogman episodes, and are available only to our channel members and to our PayPal Club members at peterbernard.com. Female Werewolf Tribe. Female Werewolf Pack Transformation. Dear Scary Stories NYC. I would like to thank you for exposing the werewolf tribes that sprang up in the Midwest in the 60s and the 70s, as I've never heard anyone else daring to broach this topic. I too was once a member of a female-dominated werewolf tribe, although I was not a leader, as the person whose testimonial I heard you read seems to have been. I was never a high-ranking member of my tribe, and I think I only stayed in it for the 12 years I did, as a sort of expression of the times. I dropped out of college to join in 1968, and I left when things got more violent than they had been before in 1980 to get married and to become a mom. In fact, I'm not personally aware of one single member of my tribe who is still even alive besides myself. Of course, that's a long time ago, so not all of them passed on due to accident or violence, but an awfully high percentage of them did. Besides our tribe, there were 8 others that I knew of, and an assumption that other werewolf packs had claimed the turf beyond our scope. We thought werewolves extended to both coasts, but who really knows? This was an era before cell phones and the internet. We only knew what we could see with our eyes and smell with our noses. This was the pre-digital age. I won't name real individuals, but I may use some nicknames. Like the nickname of our gang was the Alpha Bitch Crew, or ABC. Since bitch is not actually a curse word but just the word for a female dog, we sought to reclaim it as our own word. We called ourselves bitches, but woe be to any man who tried to use the same word. We were crazy, and we didn't just have double standards. We had triple and quadruple standards too. We were self-reliant, and we were magnificent for a long while. It got ugly by the end, and we should have quit while we were ahead, but it was a fine run. Unless you've lived absolutely free with a rampaging wolf pack, you can't truly understand what being alive even is. If I took all my years since leaving the pack and combined the entirety of that time all together, it would still not represent as much life as 1 second of my time with the pack. For some reason, my husband and kids take it as an insult when I say that, but I can't lie. There is never going to be anything that compares with running as a member of that pack. I say all this, and yet I was not really very good at being a werewolf. We didn't think of it that way anyhow. We didn't even call it being a werewolf anyway. We were witches, and we were bitches. And one of the things that we did was to hold a monthly ceremony on the full moon, in which we literally changed into actual bitches and went on a feral rampage, destroying and eating anything that got in our way. At least, most of us did. Some of us only turned into these beast-like monstrous things that couldn't really be described as human or canine. On your channel, you celebrate this kind of werewolf, or upright walking canine. But in our tribe, if you were still standing on two legs after your transformation, then you weren't really very good at what you were doing. And that would be me. My first time at the Full Moon Festival was absolutely horrific. When the ceremony began at sunset, I watched as my sisters began to moan, skyward, swaying back and forth. They howled, and I joined them. But when they began to become wolves all around me, I only felt the heat rising. I was so hot that I felt as though I were melting, and yet I was not in any way progressing toward becoming a wolf as the others were. It's not like I didn't feel any effects from the incense and chanting, but what I felt was nausea and disorientation. I was not becoming anything but ill, and yet there wasn't much I could do about it, except sort of go with the flow and hope for the best. This was the 20th century, where a lot more was expected from people, and so I just made myself be brave. As much as I was capable of doing, at least. I was one of the only college girls in the group, and I took a lot of kidding for it. I had to prove myself over and over constantly in the early days, and so nobody was going to cut me any slack just because this was my first time growing fur and fangs and claws and so forth. The first thing that actually began to change for me was my nose, and it was an indescribably uncomfortable feeling. I am partially of Middle Eastern origin, and I was living in among blonde Norse people in the Midwest back then, feeling self-conscious about my proboscis already, when the tip of my nose tilted up and began pulling out away from my face. I was having buyer's remorse about the whole joining a shape-shifting witch cult thing. Nobody told me it would make my nose bigger. I know you've heard that the ears change first, and maybe that happens for some people, but there were a few of us who I think kept their human ears all the time. Generally, our facial features would begin to change first, and then the rest would follow suit. There were people who were naturals at it, and the beasts they ended up becoming were the most like real wolves of all of us, yet larger, and faster, and stronger. The less human you were by the end, the more it was generally viewed as a triumph. In our group, there were times when the monthly wolf hunt was largely ceremonial, and there were other years where we hunted with a serious intent, due to lack of funding and food. It's hard to say what was an average day or even an average year, since we were fighting for resources with other werewolf packs, and also with human beings and other forest predators. In years of plenty, our leader would be decided through some sporting contest, but in the lean years, it would be decided by who could bring down a bear. And that was because bears were literally competing for the same food supply during those darker times. And if you don't think one single woman can bring down a bear, then you must never have met any werewolf women. Or, as we prefer to think of it, witches choosing to shapeshift into werewolves. By the way, if you don't believe this, you're not alone. My own mother says I made all this up. She says I was probably smoking crack for 12 years, but she's sure I was never a werewolf. For proof, she points out that I never transform anymore. Now that's true, but it isn't proof. I could barely transform into a two-legged upright canine type of werewolf when I was with the others, and when we were chanting and singing together. So what chance do I have of making the transformation so many years later, all by myself? My mother doesn't understand the ritual nature of this kind of transformation that we did. It wasn't lycanthropy. It wasn't an illness. It wasn't an affliction. It wasn't a curse. And it wasn't a spell. We were consciously deciding to shift the material nature of ourselves, and we were focused on becoming wolf-like. That's not the same thing as most other kinds of werewolfism or shapeshifting that I've heard or read about. I was telling you about my first time. I should get back to that. Everyone was changing faster than I was, and each person sort of had their own style to it as well. There were some other newbies there with me that first month, but none of them had any trouble at all picking it up. I was the only one who really didn't take to it naturally. And although some others seemed to experience discomfort during the cracking and the popping, I seemed to be the only one who really felt so bummed out about the whole thing. I mean, there were points where I was just all out bawling, but I couldn't exactly put my finger on why. Yes, it was painful. Yes, it was uncomfortable. But I was feeling a deep sense of sadness over something else entirely that I just can't name. As most of the pack transformed, some of them set off on a wild hunt. Some didn't, though, and I felt grateful for it. I not only was not changed into a four-legged animal, I kept sliding back and forth on parts of my transformation. It started to feel as if I were becoming human again, and then the process would begin anew, in a slightly different way than the last time. My fur would come out a different shade. The order of events during the change might alter. There were all sorts of minor differences each time, at least for me. But as I've said before and I'll say again, I wasn't really all that good at being a werewolf. All through the night I found myself changing, then changing again, and then again and again, each time into something more or less human than the last time. When our leaders came back with their kill, it fell upon those of us who still had hands to prepare the meal and cook it over a fire. There weren't many of us still standing on two legs, with the majority being the young or the old. I found it interesting that the traditionally female roles fell to the more human pack members. It's something I sorta still chuckle about till today. I really wasn't as helpful as I might normally have been that first time, as I continued to change back and forth all night until dawn. That meant my height would change. It meant the usefulness of my paws or hands would be going back and forth almost continually. I would also be more likely to follow orders when my hair and snout would recede, but less likely to even understand what was being said to me when the werewolf change reasserted itself randomly. There wasn't any kind of sympathy for what I was going through, though. Everyone was hungry, and not all of us were in a form that could digest raw meat. It needed to be cooked, and I had to help cook it. There was a lot of tough love going around that warm summer night. After dinner, we were ordered to build up the fire higher into something closer to a bonfire. We were in a clearing, but it was not so wide a clearing that I felt happy about making the fire so much larger. It seemed to me like our pack might have been starting to go a little too wild, but up on two legs as I was, nobody cared what I had to say. Humans are for following orders, I was told, even though I was by that point a dog-headed human to be certain. At dawn I became as much of a werewolf as I would ever become, which was an upright walking humanoid one, with a canine head, and a mane not unlike my human head of hair in those days. As I mentioned before, I never became a four-legged canine in all my 148 months with the pack. But that morning, when everyone else was back in their human forms, I was panicking about the fact that I had a long dog snout, and I had canine hind legs instead of my dancer's legs. Plus, I was extremely unhappy about all of this. I wasn't sure if I would ever become human again, and some of the others seemed to also be wondering if I was stuck in that halfway form forever. Our leaders pronounced that I'd probably be okay, which was at least a little bit of assurance. Probably. I was assigned my normal duties, which I found to be far more difficult to perform than usual. The others laughed at me and called me names, so I couldn't risk complaining, and I just did the best job I could under the circumstances. I cried myself to sleep that night, but by the next morning when I woke up, I was finally myself again. The end of my nose looked a little red, as though I had gotten plastered the night before, but other than that I seemed to be alright, at least until the next full moon celebration. One night many years afterward, when I was tucking my children into bed, I was telling them some stories of my days with the pack. My eldest daughter interrupted to ask me a question that some of you might be thinking right now. Mom, if it was such a wonderful, freeing experience to run with the Wolfpack, then why does it sound like you had a lot of chores? Like you cried a lot? Like the others made fun of you? How can that be the greatest experience of all time? Well, I admit that my first time was pretty rough, but even someone like me can eventually get enough of the hang of being a full moon shape-shifting wolf person that you begin to understand the legendary appeal of it. Well, maybe understand isn't the correct word. Maybe I should say something more like appreciate. It has nothing to do with your mind or your thinking, so it isn't like deciding to do something. It's just the single greatest experience that a living being can have. And once you run with the pack, you'll then be telling me why this is. Even as a bipedal beast, I felt the blood rage. I felt the killing fury. I outraced a rabbit so that I could make it my next meal. I climbed a tree and plucked a bird from the sky as it attempted to fly away. I was able to, even on 2 legs, run faster than an old lady driving home from church on Sunday and give her the fright of her life. I stopped caring about right or wrong. No, I should say I stopped believing that there was a difference between the two. And that, my friends, is the crux of the matter in this case. It was the freeing sense that anything we did was justified by the fact that we had done it. There was no right or wrong for the ABC. There was only what we wanted and what we took. And that feeling is one that I can never taste again. I am human now, and to behave like that would be evil for a human to do. But nothing is evil to a wolf. There's nothing a wolf can do that would be either good or evil, it's just natural. For a human to behave like an animal, though, this would be wrong. A human knows better than to revel in violence and death. The wolf only revels, and it is an ecstasy beyond anything that a human can ever know. Because even the most psychotic human knows more about the difference between right and wrong than any of us werewolves could understand. What we knew is to me now just a faint wisp of a memory, because I can't completely feel the emotions that an animal feels any longer. Not an uncultured animal, and that was the kind that we transformed ourselves into. We were savage beasts, and so it isn't even something that any human listening to this could or should understand. Only evil can result of humans behaving like animals. If you remember nothing else I tell you, please remember that. But that doesn't mean I won't miss that time intensely for the rest of my days. I apologize if I'm making it seem attractive because it isn't a feasible or sustainable lifestyle. You know we all collapsed due to fighting between the wolf packs, right? I got out as soon as the violence was starting, but by the end of the 80s, my entire pack was disbanded, and most of them had already passed on. A number of people went missing, and I sort of hope they found new lives somewhere else, but I doubt it. This was not a way for people to live, but I don't regret us experimenting and finding that out. We thought that all of human evolution was somehow wrong, and that we were going to rewrite it and fix it to suit our political philosophy. We ended up going from hunting game to hunting other werewolf packs to hunting down our business enemies. We became the same as any other mob, as any other racket. We started out thinking we were going to be changing the world for the better, making it a place of greater possibilities for everyone. The only one of us who even survived that time was me, and I took on a traditional lifestyle after leaving the tribe. We changed nothing, and most of us passed on long before our time. But it doesn't matter. If you sent me back in time and told me that I had a chance to live my life again without the Wolfpack, you know what I would do? I would go and join that Wolfpack all over again. It was my fate to do it, and to learn that it's wrong for people to do what I did. It's my own personal contradiction. But that was a different time. I beg of you, young people of today, don't follow in the path of my generation. I lost all my friends and spiritual sisters far too young. And for what? To prove to ourselves and the world that our philosophy was flawed and couldn't hold water any better than a colander. You should be grateful there is nothing like that group of women around anymore in this day and age. The world is better off without the female werewolf tribe. About the coolest person that could ever be is today's executive producer, Chris C. Please join me in thanking today's executive producer, Chris C., for making this episode possible. Chris gets to see our secret uncensored episodes. Queen of the White Wolves. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I like your stories about werewolves admitting the truth about themselves. I can relate, you see, and I'd like to share my story with you as well. See, for some decades I ran as queen of a white werewolf pack. I mean white fur, in case you were thinking something else. They were blonde, I was blonde, and we fit together for a really long time. This started when I was young, back in the 70s. I grew up in a small town in Wisconsin, but this is not going to be a Wisconsin werewolf story. I was working in a diner when this fancy city boy started talking me up. Apparently he was discovering me. That's what he kept saying. I lived pretty far from Hollywood, and I didn't really believe too much what this guy said. I was a pretty girl, and my dad taught me to never believe anything that any guy ever said to me, unless he could prove it. Dad said men instinctively lie to pretty girls. So it was my job to learn to be a detective of life, you know? To do my own research, to figure out for myself what's true, and what's some guy trying to get me in bed. It's probably good advice for you, too, even if you aren't blonde and 19. At any rate, this guy was a photographer, and he paid cash in advance for photo shoots. He promised me no nudity, and so I took his money. It was getting paid to just stand there. That was how I felt about it. As I got to trust him more, we started taking day trips to locations so that he could get different kinds of backgrounds. I thought he was using these for art shows or something. I was only dimly interested in his discussions about his business. It turned out these images were being used in advertising. In the major cities, people were becoming familiar with my face. But since none of the ads reached small-town America where I lived, I didn't find out about any of this till many years later. This situation wasn't to last very long, though, because that photographer and I were about to hop into a small personal airplane and fly straight into the side of a mountain. Now, there's a range of mountains in northern Alaska that this guy decided he needed to get me on top of for a photo shoot. Now, the idea that he and this other guy thought they could land their plane on top of a mountain indicates how good the cocaine was back in the 70s, because there's no way we could have done that. The place they wanted to take photos from was in the Arctic National Wildlife Preserve. Maybe we could have gotten there by helicopter, but it was so windy up there, It's so dangerous flying close to the mountains that I'm not even sure we could have done it that way. And as I already said, what happened was we slammed right into the side of one of those mountains, and we fell to the ground hard. I assume both men died, while I lay there, bleeding out, and getting ready to meet my maker. Some white wolves with beautiful glowing eyes came to me, and they began to lick at my wounds. I thought they were drinking my blood. I mean, I suppose they were, but I expected them to start eating me alive at any moment, and I mercifully passed out from the fear. When I woke up, I wondered if I had died, and if this were heaven or hell. I seemed to be inside a cavernous space, and my wounds seemed to have been cleaned. I was no longer bleeding, but I felt dizzy when I would try to sit up, so I stopped trying to sit up. When I laid back down, I could tell that I was on soft white fur. I remembered the white wolves then, who had licked my body wounds. This fur I was lying on was that same kind of fur as those wolves had. I fell in and out of sleep for some time. I couldn't know how long. It might have been hours, or days, or weeks. I don't have any way of telling. Months, possibly, or minutes, maybe. There weren't just the white wolves there. I remembered silhouettes that more closely resembled humans. I remember finally waking up feeling very hungry, and I was brought some meat soup by a boy and an old man, who introduced themselves and asked my name. I honestly couldn't remember my name in that moment, which sounds weird and dramatic. No, I didn't have amnesia like on a soap opera. Or maybe I sort of did, but it was only in the first 15 or 20 minutes, as I was getting food in my belly and waking up for real, that my memories were in a haze. When I didn't immediately give them my name, the two decided I would be called the Fair One, and that sort of became my embarrassing nickname. I was treated like an honored guest by these two, and as I ate and drank their simple fare, I began to remember who I was, how the plane had crashed, and the strange way I came to be where I was. I started feeling panicked, and I asked the old man to please tell me where he found me, and if there were any other survivors. He told me that the man who found me was out hunting, and when he returned, he would explain everything over dinner. That was my first sense that I was not alone with these two. I think I had thought that they were also shipwrecked or lost, but instead they seemed to be part of a larger group. I wondered why they chose to live in a cave, but I needed to sleep after eating, and so my questions had to wait till later. The next time I woke up, a dog was licking my face and making me giggle. I opened my eyes and was somewhat surprised and frightened to see that it was a white wolf that was in front of me. Possibly one of the ones I saw lapping up my blood from my wounds back at the crash site. I went from full relaxation to my heart beating faster than a Keith Moon drum solo, and I thought I was about to experience some terribly painful things, to put it mildly. The white wolf reared up on its hind legs and seemed to grow in front of my eyes. I screamed and thought I was losing my mind, but I saw the dog turn into, well, it's hard to describe what it turned into, 'cause it wasn't a man, but it wasn't a dog anymore either. It was humanoid, and it stood on its hind legs. I won't call it an upright walking canid though, which is a term I've heard on the internet. It had a dog shape when down on all fours, but it looked like a dog-headed man when it was standing up like that. I felt like I was seeing things, and that someone was trying to trick me, or play head games with me or something like that. When the dog-headed man began struggling to speak to me in a version of English, I wanted to scream and run out of there. I wasn't really strong enough to stand, let alone run away, and I had no idea where I would be running to inside this guy's cave. I was pretty much at his mercy in that moment, at every succeeding moment, until I got my legs under me again. So I tried very hard to understand the words he was trying to speak to me. Soon the human boy from earlier came along and translated for me. Like he told me that I was laying on the pelt of a former leader of the tribe, and this was intended by them as a show of great honor. It was too cold where they lived for the fur to be buried on the person, so it was kept and held sacred instead. Once I began to understand the large white-furred wolfman's accent, as well as his speech impediment brought about by not actually having a human mouth, I began to understand his meaning better. Soon, we needed no translator at all, but I'll get to that part when it comes up later. So this big muscular white-furred guy starts telling me in his way how he found me and the two others. The men were already lost, but he started licking my wounds, trying to bring me back. When he told me that his saliva had the power to heal, I nodded as if I believed him. In actuality, I just thought he was a simple half-human. I was humoring him. When he told me that I would soon become like him, and that I would be strong enough to run with his pack, I had to stifle a giggle. He was very cute with his Tarzan act, but I was a woman of the 20th century, and I hoped I could get my job at the diner back now that my photographer employer had moved on to the other side. I had no plans of running with this guy's dog pack, but when I tried to tell him that in a polite way, it was his turn to stifle a chuckle. "When you change for the first time," he said, "I will try to be there to help you through it. My sister will be there in either case." Leader brought his sister around, who I also called Sister. Everyone seemed to call her that. She began to help me exercise a few times a day, and she tried to warn me about how I would begin to change, but I didn't really listen to her for some reason. I had seen a wolf become a wolf man, but I didn't really believe him when he said that I would become a wolf woman. Sister told me that she and Leader were from a line of wolves who got transformed into werewolves. They had no human forms, only werewolf and canine. Sister said that I would be living between human and wolf woman forms, but I would not likely ever fully transform into a wolf as she was able to do. This was all amusing to me at the time, and I continued to humor my rescuers, somehow thinking that I understood the world better than they did. Of course, people wouldn't have wasted their time warning me if nothing was going to happen, so I just wasn't being logical. I guess it was too big a thing to wrap my mind around at the time. But then, of course, came the day that I finally began to physically change. Even if I had taken the warnings seriously, I couldn't have prepared for what happened. I didn't take them seriously, though, and so I was completely knocked for a loop when my actual appearance started to change. I know I was technically a model, but I think I had worked as a waitress longer than as a photographer's model, and I don't think I was any more vain about my appearance than any other young woman from my generation. But to feel your face, and to know that it's changing shape, this is a really upsetting thing to have happen to you. I've listened to programs on your channel where werewolves describe their ears changing first. With me, it was the nose. The end of it sort of turned up, and I could see it happening right in front of my eyes. After the end turned up, it turned darker and leathery, and little fine fur or downy hair started popping out all over my face, a very light platinum blonde hair. Now this might be a secret, or it might have been back then, but I was not a natural platinum blonde. I was naturally a person with light brown hair, and in some light my eyebrows didn't look too dark, so I wasn't as obvious about it as some, but I was not a natural blonde. The fur growing out of my face was naturally very, very pale blonde though, which made no sense to me when it was first happening. I'll cut to the chase and explain that mystery right off the bat by telling you that I am a natural blonde now. I haven't dyed my hair since before I got into that photographer's friend's plane on that day. Something about the transformation turned me blonde all over, and a very pale shade of it, too. So as I was panicking, Sister showed up with the leader, and I began yelling at him. I accused him of turning me into an ugly monster, and I called him sick and evil. He took my insults without getting angry, then explained to me that I was dying from my wounds when he found me. When he licked my wounds, the natural curative agents in his saliva healed my wounds, thus beginning my first stage of recovery from the accident. I had internal injuries too, and it wasn't quite as simple as all that, but because I had been contacted internally by his bodily fluids, my body began to have what he called an anti-disease. Now I doubt that's an actual word or a term, but his meaning was clear. I now had a condition whereby my metabolism had become able to speed up its healing repairs of my body, both on the outside and on the inside. Now the rough part about all of this is that these healing effects are a side effect of becoming a werewolf, a hybrid kind of creature between humans and wolves. I was no longer who I had always been. I was now painfully and agonizingly becoming someone entirely new. I did not fully transform that first night, nor in that first week. Leader said he'd never seen someone take so long to fully change, and he worried that my system wasn't strong enough to be a werewolf. But it did eventually happen, and once it did, I tried to remain in that form whenever I could, at least during the first month or two. It was the strength and the power. I had never felt anything like those in my life. I could suddenly run faster than any human. I was suddenly stronger than the strongest man. I had never fantasized about power or speed, but once I had them, I got drunk on them. The first time I joined the men on the hunt, the females regarded me strangely. I reacted differently to the change than any female they had ever seen. I reminded them that most of the females they knew started off canine and not human. I had never before had permission to chase animals. I never had been told that it would be alright to leap on the back of a fleeing deer, to drink the blood of my prey, to be more savage than the devil himself. I went insane with it at first, causing the females to fear me, and the men to all respect and desire me. When I say men, of course, in this context, I mean animals. Animals like what I had become. Animals like what I now enjoyed being. After some moons had come and gone, the leader took me as his wife, and I retired from the hunt. It would be my job to lead the pack in leader's absence, and we couldn't both place our lives at risk at once on the hunt. Twice a year, though, I was still allowed out under the moon to chase and to kill and to eat. Leader stayed home on those nights because, as I said, we couldn't both place our lives at risk at the same time. I lost track of the years as we measured time differently in the pack, but it was the year 2006 when a traveler happened upon our cave and spotted me. A human traveler, I mean. I did not know that 30 years had passed since I joined the wolves, and apparently nature didn't either. I still looked the same as I had when I first arrived, and this man was quite handsome. We soon started talking. I was in my human form, but kind of embarrassed to be wearing rags as I was. The man told me he could bring me back to civilization and that we should get going. I of course was torn, and so I brought him back into the cave to meet the pack. Leader was of course most upset about the prospect of me leaving. The traveler agreed to stay for dinner and to leave the next day, whether it be with me or without. Leader and I discussed the situation, and since he was such an honest beast, he told me that it was only our werewolf forms who were married. It would be wrong for an animal and a human to marry, obviously, so when I was in my human form, and when he was in his wolf form, we were both free of our commitments to each other. Therefore, if I wanted to return to the human world, I was free to do so. The thing of it was, once I left sight of the cave entrance, there was next to no chance that I would ever find my way back. I had to make up my mind to stay or to leave, but in either case, the decision was going to be a permanent one. I missed the human world very badly, though, and so the next morning, I said goodbye to my family. They treated me as queen of their pack, and yet for some reason, I missed television, and I missed Burger King. Well, once we hit a First Nations settlement on the way south toward rescue, and I first saw human beings again, I felt something different. I no longer felt that I was one of the white wolves. I think I'm trying to say that I was somehow human again. I mean, my hair stayed blonde, but I began to age. Once I was away from those people, I discovered that I soon began to look as old as I should have been looking all along. That traveler rescued a woman who looked like a teenage model. The woman he later turned over to the medical unit for examination was judged to be in her late 40s, which was my true age by that point. Now I live back in the United States, near the town I grew up in Wisconsin. I married my old high school boyfriend, but he had a violence problem, so that didn't last long. I have to work 2 crappy jobs, but I still can't seem to cover my bills. And my back is aching, but I can't afford to see a doctor. They fired all the smart doctors anyway, so if I had stayed with the werewolves, I'd have someone to rub my back if it hurt. Who am I kidding? My back would heal if I threw it out up there. I should have turned around and headed back to that cave when I still knew how to find it. It's too late now. I left behind the life I was meant to lead. I left behind the family who cared about me. I left behind my friends, and I left behind a man who loved me more than any man in this world is ever going to. And so I write this email to you in order to keep Leader and Sister and the others alive in my heart a little while longer. I wish I could return to them and remain forever young in the hidden cave in the mountains. I wish I could once more be Queen of the White Wolves. Whether you drive on Firestone or BF Goodrich, you gotta say thanks to old Butch Rudrich. Please join me in thanking Butch Rudrich for rejoining our channel memberships. It's great to see so many of our old members returning and donating to keep the channel alive. The green-haired dog lady of the woods. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I've got a dogman transformation story for you, or I guess a dog lady transformation anyway. I don't mind what you call me, as long as you mean it in a friendly manner. You can even crack jokes about me having a dog face or whatever. Although I didn't exactly ask to become a werewolf woman. It was a gift from a dear friend. I'm not entirely unhappy with it. I had to grow to like it, I'll be honest. But I've never had a normal life anyhow, so I've adjusted. In some ways it's not as nice as being a real girl, but in other ways it's sort of better than it used to be when I was human. I don't mean to say I'm not real anymore or that I'm not human. I just mean I'm only human part-time these days. I see people in your comment section asking how to become a werewolf, and others explaining methods that they claim work. Let me explain yet another way that you can find yourself becoming a werewolf woman. Or guy, for that matter. At least, according to me. And my opinions may not reflect those of this channel. Now, I went to art school and I had a few girlfriends, but I also like to spend time alone. I'd go to clubs with my girls, but then I'd head off into the woods with my dog Ninja next to me. Ninja was a mixed breed of some sort or another. That was all I knew back then. We would explore the woods together, and he would guide me home. He always knew the way back, and he always knew when we should leave, like when a bear was approaching, or some mean girls from school. He was a pretty magical friend. One day when he ate some mushrooms, so did I. I figured he would know if they were safe, since Ninja seemed to understand those woods. Well, we both went on a bit of a voyage together that afternoon, and we had to sit down for a few hours before we could stand up and walk back home. During that time when the world spun around us, and every single thing seemed to breathe in and out, Ninja talked to me. I assumed I was hallucinating, so I just went with it. He told me that he was really a werewolf, but he chose to stay in dog form because he loved me and he wanted the best for me. I just thought that was so sweet that I hugged him and cried. Although he did draw blood when he did what he did. I asked him what that was all about, and he said that he just gave me a gift. After his time on Earth was done, and he could no longer be my protector and guide, then I would become the next werewolf, and I could protect and guide myself. I laughed inside, and I might have laughed on the outside too, I can't remember. Well, eventually, years later, it came time for that dog to move on to the next world, and I was hit pretty hard by it. My girls wanted to take me out to cheer me up, but I asked to put that off for a night or two. I wanted to be alone, and I wanted to go into those woods in remembrance of my friend who I had lost. It was there when I first began to change, to transform. It was Ninja's promise come fulfilled. It was his gift being passed on to me. I sort of knew that right from the beginning, but it's not an easy thing to accept if you know what I mean. Even if you think you believe in werewolves, that doesn't mean you expect a hallucinated promise from your dog to come true upon his passing, unless I didn't hallucinate that promise. Once the transformation starts, it pretty much takes over what you're doing. I mean, you aren't going to be able to watch YouTube or listen to tunes once the change starts hitting you. That first time it happened to me, the change sort of kept progressing, then regressing, then advancing again. To be honest, it still happens that way for me around a quarter to a third of the time, but usually not as bad as that first time. I kept thinking it was stopping, and then I was getting better, but then something else would happen. Well, like my lips turned black, and then my nose did too. And then it started to sort of go back to normal, except the next thing that happened was me growing fangs or whatever. I think the ear thing happens first for me most often. It's like my hair bunches up and becomes flesh ears, and then holes open up that connect to my ear canals. Suddenly I can hear like 10 times, 20 times, who knows how many times more stuff than I could hear before. I'll get real with you. That first time that I lost my hearing and then regained it so much louder and more detailed, I was not seeing this as a positive development. This was information overload. I mean, don't get me wrong. I don't think canines are smarter than humans, as it's clearly not the case. But there are ways in which werewolves process sensory information that's far more efficient than the way humans do. Or at least, I can hear more and I can understand more about what I'm hearing when I'm in my furry form than when I'm original flavor me. The same sort of thing happens for your ability to smell as well, but not until your nose folds out like an accordion. That was the worst part of any of it for me the first time. Since then I know it's coming, but the first time your face begins to extend out in front of your eyes, you probably aren't gonna enjoy it. Sometimes I'm growing fangs at the same time as that, and it can actually really hurt. Usually though I become conscious of the fangs either before or after the snout extends itself. I apologize for not being able to give you a simple listicle explaining what happens first, second, and so forth, but every part of my life is chaotic. My brother says I'm chaotic neutral. I don't know about the neutral part, but I got the word chaos tattooed on my body in a secret place. And I'm telling you, fate tattooed it all over my life in the same way. Each time I become the werewolf, it happens in different ways and in different orders. Like it's still having trouble interfacing with my nervous system. I mean, maybe it is. Maybe that's why it works differently each time for me. I'm just guessing though, obviously. A lot of what was happening the first time was utterly baffling to me. I only witnessed parts of it reflected back in large mud puddles in the woods, since it had rained recently. It wasn't until the second time it happened that I could actually witness a good 70 or 80% of the transformation in a mirrored surface and understand it all better. The first time was the most frightening time, since I didn't know that I wasn't dying, to be honest. I felt like I was in that old movie The Thing, where I was mutating all over the place. I might have been exploding for all I knew. I mean, I did remember what I had hallucinated my old pooch saying to me, but I didn't really put that together with this until the second time, when I could see it clearly as it was happening. This first time was pain and fear, and my heart going so fast that I thought it was going to break itself and stop working. That first time, I actually went all the way to becoming a four-legged werewolf. That's only happened one time again since then. I usually stop changing at some point when I'm still up on two legs. I did write down a description of the end part of my first transformation in my diary back the next day after it happened. I'm gonna cut and paste that directly in here because it's a fresher memory of it than I could possibly write for you today. I warn you, it's a bit ornate and flowery, which was my style before I started spending my nights running around barefoot, chasing people around and scaring everybody in the woods. My new lifestyle can bring you a little more down to earth than my old art school scene. Anyway, here's how I remembered my first transformation the morning after it happened. As the full moon rose high in the night sky, I could feel an inexplicable restlessness stirring within me. It was a strange sensation, as if my very essence were being pulled toward the celestial body above. My heart raced, and a tingling sensation coursed through my veins, as if something primal were awakening within me. I had always been drawn to the mysteries of the night, but this was different. This was as if the moon's silver light were calling out to me, beckoning me to embrace a hidden part of myself. As the clock struck midnight, an overwhelming surge of energy coursed through my body, causing my muscles to tense and my skin to prickle. Suddenly an intense pain gripped me, as if my bones were being reshaped and rearranged. I fell to the ground, writhing in agony, unable to comprehend what was happening to me. It felt as if my body were being torn apart, as if I were being reborn into something entirely new. And then, in a moment of sheer terror and exhilaration, I felt my limbs elongate and contort, my fingers stretching into sharp claws. My senses heightened, and I could hear the rustling of leaves in the distance and the faint heartbeat of a rabbit nearby. My vision transformed, allowing me to see in the darkness with an uncanny clarity. As the transformation continued, I stood on powerful legs, covered in a thick coat of fur that shimmered under the moonlight. I was a creature of the night, a werewolf. The rush of adrenaline and the raw power coursing through my veins. It was both exhilarating and terrifying. In that moment, I felt a connection to the primal forces of nature, a deep understanding of the untamed wilderness that surrounded me. The world seemed to come alive in a way I had never experienced before. Every scent, every sound, every movement became vivid and intense. As the moonlight bathed my body, a tingling sensation began to spread from the tips of my fingers to the depths of my soul. It was an electrifying feeling, as if every cell in my body were awakening, pulsating with an untamed energy. The power surged through me, coursing through my veins like a wild river, and I could feel my muscles growing stronger, more resilient. As the transformation took hold, my senses sharpened further, and the world around me came alive in a way I had never experienced before. The air carried scents that were previously undetectable. The rustling of leaves became more beautiful than any of my favorite music, and the moonlit landscape seemed to glow with an ethereal beauty. It was as though a veil had been lifted, revealing a hidden realm that had always existed right there, but had somehow remained unseen. And then I ran. I ran so fast that I realized I had never even known what running was before that moment. I could run faster than any woman. I could run faster than anyone at all. Oh, the exhilaration of it. The wind whipped through my fur, and my paws effortlessly propelled me forward with a speed that surpassed any human or wolf. It almost felt like I was flying, my body effortlessly gliding through the night, leaving everything speeding past me in a blur. The ground beneath me became a mere suggestion, as if I could defy gravity itself. But it wasn't just the speed that amazed me, it was my new strength as well. With each stride, I could feel sheer, raw power coursing through my limbs, muscles flexing with an intensity I had never known. I could leap over obstacles effortlessly, my body defying the limitations of human physicality. It was a heady feeling, a sense of invincibility that made me feel like I could conquer anything. Yet, in among the rush of power and freedom, there was also a primal instinct that emerged. The hunt. The desire to chase, to capture, to taste the rewards of that hunt. It was a part of me that I had never known existed, a deep-rooted connection to my animal nature. It was both terrifying and liberating, a duality that I struggled to comprehend. In that moment, as I ran with the strength and speed of a creature born of legend, I realized that I had become something more than human. I had become a werewolf, a being of immense power and untamed instinct. And though the transformation was both awe-inspiring and overwhelming, there was a part of me that I could no longer deny. But in amid the thrill of this newfound power, a sense of loss and confusion lingered. I was no longer the woman I once was. I had become a creature of the night, forever bound to the cycles of the moon. The duality of my existence, the struggle between my human self and the beast within, would forever shape my life. Countering that sense of loss was its equal and other side, the sense of duty binding me to this new life. My good friend had decided I would succeed him as the werewolf, and I had a duty to perform to my lost friend. I would be the werewolf, and I will be the werewolf until it comes time for me to pass the mantle on as well. As the first rays of dawn broke through the horizon, I felt the transformation slowly recede, my body returning to its human form. Exhausted and bewildered, I lay on the forest floor, contemplating the profound experience I had just undergone. From that night forward, I would forever be caught between two worlds, forever torn between the human and the beast. The moon had awakened something deep within me, something wild and untamed, and as I rose to my feet, ready to face the challenges that lay ahead, I knew that my new life would never be the same again. Yeah, like I warned you, that was a lot more flowery than I would phrase any of it today. Also, I sorta cut a lot out, and made it seem as though it all proceeded in an orderly fashion the way they show it in the movies, you know? It was much messier than that, and a lot scarier too. I thought I was gonna die. And in an ugly way, like that old movie Scanners, if you know what I mean. And if you don't know what I mean, well, just forget it. Especially if you're eating while watching this video. I thought it was lights out for me, and there actually was a moment of temporary blindness for me as my system kicked over to the dog's way of seeing things. It's sort of better in some ways and worse in others. Like, you probably wouldn't get as much out of studying a painting with dog eyes. But if you're looking to catch a rabbit to eat for dinner, then you're far better off going canine than human, believe me. Anyway, once I was more or less fully transformed, I could remember so many more things than before. I felt like I knew everything Ninja had done when he was the werewolf. And the same for the werewolf before him, and before him. There were mostly dogs or wolves that turned into werewolves. But I was not the first human or the first female in the lineage. Being the werewolf is an important function, I guess you might say. It is not an honorary position. There needs to be a werewolf in each generation. I don't know why, but I know that's the way it is. One time, one of my friends started quizzing me about all this. She wanted to know what exactly my turf was, and how much land I had to be the werewolf on. And were there werewolves everywhere? Were they broken down by state or county lines? I mean, she was half joking, but the truth is, I don't really know. I mean, I, the human being, don't really know the extent of the werewolf's turf. I just know that she knows, and I trust her to carry out her rounds and duties. And there will always need to be one in the future as well. We aren't just monsters. We don't kill and eat flesh. We kill and eat something that I guess might be better described as sin. I mean, I haven't stepped inside a church since I was a kid, so I don't feel like it's my place to comment on sinners and saints. But I just know that the werewolf, she goes after people who do abnormally bad things. And when I say people, I don't mean just humans. I mean points of consciousness lacking intelligence. Or points of intelligence lacking consciousness. Both are equally tasty to a werewolf. We are sin eaters. We eat animals who are diseased. But nothing hurts a werewolf. We swallow disease. And we leave behind a chance to rebuild something healthier than what had been there before our arrival. One of my friends compares me to a gardener pruning my plants, while another friend calls me the exterminator, which needs no further explanation. But the exterminator takes life away to make a healthier life possible in his wake. The exterminator is necessary. The exterminator is the werewolf. And the werewolf is me. Woman to wolfwoman. I don't know how I became a werewolf. Dear Scary Stories NYC. I've been scouring the internet for the past few months, trying to understand how I became a werewolf, and why I transform at night into a dangerous creature that's neither human nor dog. I wasn't bitten by a wolf. I've never seen a dogman or werewolf in my life, and I don't know what to do about any of this. Almost none of my friends or family even believe me when I say that I've become a wolf woman. But even fewer believe me when I say that I don't understand why this is happening. One person even told me that not knowing how you became a werewolf is as unlikely as not understanding how you got pregnant. It's pretty much nearly impossible. But that's what's happened to me. I found a story on your channel about someone transforming after exposure to some kind of germ or illness, I forget. So I'm sending my story to you in hopes that it might help me find some answers. Now, even though I'm keeping all this anonymous, I do ask that you show your attractive brunette actress in the beginning and say that's me. I mean to say, show her dressed up to go dancing or something, because before this all started, that's who I was. I mean, I wasn't as beautiful as that actress you used, but I was that type, fit and fashionable, with curly dark hair. I was fairly good at my job, but I got told I was great at it because of how I looked. And back then, I looked nice all the time. How do I know this was why I got special treatment? Because once this werewolf thing happened, it got a lot harder for me to glam myself up in the morning. I stopped getting special treatment when that happened. Not just from the guys, but from other women as well, believe it or not. And that taught me a lot about what my bosses actually value in my performance. And that is how I look while performing it and little else. Well, and nothing else. But this is not a story about me griping about workplace issues. This is the story of how I inexplicably found myself changed from the normal human being I always was into the mutant thing I am now. Everything started when a coworker gave me a thumb drive from a client, and I left it there at the office, forgetting to transfer the contents to my laptop hard drive first. I got all the way home before realizing I had forgotten it, and it was going to be 5 days before I was scheduled to come back into the building. I got on my cell and called my boss, who was still in. He told me to rush back and get the thumb drive before he left the office for a few days himself. Well, it had just been raining, so I threw on some jeans and an army jacket and I jogged downtown from my apartment to get that errand done. It was on the walk back home when things started to get really crazy. There was a carnival set up on one of the streets near the office, so I decided to walk through that on the way home. They had cotton candy. They had booths where you could try to hit things with balls or whatever, and they had some rides, including a Ferris wheel. I was impressed at how much stuff they packed into the 3-block-long run of the temporary carnival, and I wandered into the central block of it, and the middle of the crowd, before I noticed that I was starting to ache all over. I was feeling something that reminded me of my mother telling me the baby was kicking when she was carrying my younger sister in her belly. But soon I was feeling like something was inside of me kicking in my arms and my legs and my head, just as much as in my belly. I didn't know what was happening to me, but it was both painful and incredibly weird and uncomfortable feeling. I stopped a random stranger and asked them what was wrong with me. It was a nonsensical question. I was having difficulty formulating thought. He gave me a look that said I was more than crazy, and I looked around for a mirror in my purse, spilling the contents all over the place, including the thumb drive I had gone to work to get. My makeup mirror shattered on the cobblestone street, but in the broken shards, I saw myself transforming into something entirely different right there on the street. First, I noticed the end of my nose was reddening, which terrified me, as I had no history of skin conditions, and this seemed to be a severe one. My mind jumped immediately to some extreme kinds of illnesses, and I began to panic. When I turned my gaze away from the tiny broken mirrors on the pavement, I caught a reflection of myself in a store window, and that was the first time I noticed the ears. The dog ears, up on top of my head. I reached up and felt them and I screamed. Not only could I feel the ears with my fingertips, but I could feel my fingertips with my ears. My ears. My actual real ears, which could hear so much more than my old ears used to be able to. I must be drugged. That was my first thought. It made more sense to me than to think that I had really grown super sensitive dog or cat ears up on top of my head. When some strange kid laughed at me and said I had cat ears on top of my head, I wondered if I was hallucinating that kid too. I walked closer to him, staring at him to see if he was real, and the kid screamed as I approached. He ran away, either in reality or in my imagination. The next time I caught my own reflection, I screamed as loudly as that kid just had. The raw red end of my nose was now pure black, like it had rotted and was gonna fall off. I touched it, but it felt fine, although leathery, like the end of a dog's nose. It was actually a relief that it hadn't rotted. I wasn't turning into a zombie. But what was I turning into? I stopped being able to think, as a pain gripped my jaws, like all my teeth were having toothaches, all at one time together. It hurt so badly that it became hard to even remember who I was. The only thing left in my mind was that I wanted to understand what was happening. I got myself in front of a dark reflective store window, and I opened my mouth to reveal something out of an old horror movie. I had fangs. I had some kind of long monster teeth like it was Halloween, only these weren't plastic and glow in the dark. These seemed to be my own real teeth. But where did my old regular teeth go to? I looked around on the street. I didn't see teeth. Then I couldn't remember what I was even looking for, as another change overtook me, forcing me to just cope with the changes that I had no control over. Thunder and lightning frightened and confused me, as though I didn't know what they were. In fact, I kept internally reminding myself that it was just thunder, and yet that only got me more nervous inside. I couldn't explain it then, but now of course we all know it was me becoming an animal. I have to ask, why would this be happening to me? I looked around and nobody else was having the problems I was. It wasn't like a zombie outbreak of werewolves, it was only me. But I'd never had any reason to think I might be a victim of lycanthropy. I started to wonder if I might be descended from a line of werewolves, that maybe this could be an inherited condition. I speed dialed my mother, but when she picked up, I couldn't actually form words any longer. I've heard stories on your and other channels of dogmen or werewolves speaking English, and I would like to know how that could be. I was still in the middle of the transformation, and my snout was still not fully extended, yet all I could do was make pathetic animal noises into my phone and get my mother all frightened. I decided I should shoot video of myself, partially so that I could see the transformation, and partially so that I could prove it happened later on. But I found my furry, clawed fingertips did not correctly operate the touchscreen. I couldn't get the thing to work, and in a rage, I threw my phone into a brick wall. Trust me, that was very out of character, as normally I treat my phone better than I've ever treated any boyfriend. And I've treated all of them very well. I've treated most of them very well. The remaining few we shall not discuss. I can't really have boyfriends anymore. It's sort of a time-consuming thing. Plus, most guys who are into women are not into ones with dog faces. I'm making jokes because this is a sore subject I'd rather skip over quickly. I have met guys who say they're into werewolf girls, but not many of them are still saying that after a few little love bites. Where are the real men these days? Probably dating human women, that's where. All jokes aside, I had just thrown my phone into a wall. I was unable to speak using my mouth. I was unable to use a touch screen with my clawed paw-like hands, and I was panicking and howling, hoping that someone would come and help me. But how could they help me? What could they do? How could I help myself? I was becoming some kind of a monster, and I didn't know when or where it was gonna stop. Like, would it be only my body becoming furry and my face elongating and growing fangs, or would it continue changing until I was a four-legged creature crawling around on the ground? And after this all happened, would I ever change back? And would it be within a few hours? A few days? A few years? My mother has since told me that she knows of no werewolf stories from either side of our family. But I already guessed that by how surprised she was by my weird animal sound phone call. If this ran in the family, she'd have probably been waiting for that call to one day come. As the fur grew on my face, my worldview started to alter. My eyes must have been changing as well, because I felt that the world was so much brighter and more detailed than before. I could smell people walking past me, something I had never done before. It seemed so normal, though, that I wondered if I had always been doing it, but just not making conscious note of it. There were a lot of heightened sensations like that when I became a werewolf for the first time, and they all felt like déjà vu. They felt a bit like a homecoming, or a return to a place that I knew well in some manner. Explain that part of it to me, if you can, because I can't. I went from being ignored on the street, as I needed help from people, to being screamed at and run from, once the transformation progressed further. Rather than wanting their help, I was starting to see these people as ants, or worms all around me. I didn't want to hurt them, but I found them to be a nuisance and a bother. I wanted them to go away, and I felt good inside when they got scared and ran from me. At some point I caught a glimpse of a monster in a store window, and I bluff charged it, roaring in its direction. I was surprised when the monster did the same thing as me. And that was because it was my own reflection. I walked up more closely to that reflection, and I saw that my eyes were now glowing in a strange and unnatural way, and that I was not a human being any longer. I ran from where I was, leaping over screaming people and past them, heading toward the woods outside of town. I leaped up on top of a police car, and I surfed the flashing lights on top as the long arm of the law drove me to where I wanted to go. When traffic slowed, I got out and leaped from car roof to car roof, landing off on the side of the road and running into the woods. From that point, I began to hear howling, and I found myself howling back. I was being directed, and I was being called. I knew how to follow these calls, but I don't when I wake back up into human life. I lack instincts when I'm in this form. In the werewolf world, everything is the same as in the world of wild dogs. This means it's about status, and mine is low. Those of you dreaming of being werewolves should hope that you will arrive in this world with an important relative or a benefactor, because I know what it's like if you don't. If I only knew why this was happening, it might at least make sense. I have lost faith in the human world because I'm so erratic now, and my sense of beauty is dead and gone. It's even worse when I'm a wolf woman. I'm thinking now that I should leave the pack and become a female lone wolf. I'm thinking that now when I'm in my human form. When I become the she-wolf, I seem too concerned with what the big dogs think. I probably could survive on my own just fine, but I don't have the inclination to even try to do so when I'm in the animal form. It just doesn't seem a priority any longer. I'm extremely disappointed in my other self. I thought werewolves were badass and unafraid of anything. Turns out I am unafraid of people, but I'm way too eager to please the other dogmen, at least in my own opinion. My mother says I should lock myself up when it comes time to change, so that I don't go see the other werewolves in the woods. I'm afraid that if I did that, I'd tear up my apartment, scare my neighbors, and it's possible my howling could draw an entire pack of adult werewolves to my apartment complex. That would be a less than ideal development for me and my neighbors. It's a good idea, but I would need the right location to tie myself down in. And my mother is certainly not suggesting I do it at her place. So my life is teetering on the brink. I feel like I'm about to tip over into the abyss, I really do. A few more late payments, and I might be living in my mother's basement whether I like it or not. Or maybe that would be too dangerous for her. Maybe I might end up homeless. And it might happen soon. Certainly not something to look forward to. If only I could understand how this started and why this is happening. Maybe then I could begin to put together a plan to get out of this situation that I got myself into. Or someone got me into. Or something. Some act of fate? Could I have been poisoned? I hadn't dated anyone for 3 months prior to the transformation, so it was not any sort of bodily fluid exchange that caused it. I am honestly at a loss to explain, just as I'm at a loss to pay my bills lately. If anyone in your audience has any idea what might be happening to me, please ask them to leave a comment, and I will read them when I'm in human form. Thanks for considering running my story, and good luck to you and your channel. She's been the EP 2 times in the last 4 days. Welcome our newest channel member. I'm talking about Angie K. Please join me in welcoming Angie K to our channel memberships. Now Angie gets to see our weekly secret uncensored Dogman stories, as well as our over 25 hours of archived scary Dogman stories too. And we know when she's seen them, because Angie is always great about leaving a comment, which is one of the ways you can help the channel out a lot. Thanks Angie, and welcome aboard. And here to tell you about other cool ways to get more involved in the channel is our international TV spokesmongrel, Henry Lee Dogman. Hank? Thanks Biggie, and thanks to all of you for watching this far. If you liked it, please click like. If you'd like to see more of our work, please subscribe. And also click that bell icon if you'd like to be notified when we put out a new episode. To become an executive producer, you can donate to us through the thanks button under each of our videos, or through our paypal.me/PeterBernard209 page. To receive cool perks like secret uncensored Dogman episodes far too wild to ever run on this channel, you can become a YouTube channel member by clicking the join button, or join our PayPal subscribers club at peterbernard.com. Joining either at the $3 a month level or above gets you access to our over 25 hours of secret uncensored Dogman stories available nowhere else. Do you have a scary story about Dogman or some other kind of high strangeness that happened to you? Let us know by emailing us at scarystoriesnyc@gmail.com, or by leaving us a voicemail message at 804-LA-SCARY. You may need to call back on that when it cuts off after I think 3 minutes. And if you don't want to do any of that stuff, thank you for simply watching to the end. Good night, and have a scary tomorrow.
Come back for more scary stories.